Hi everyone, welcome to California Rebel Base. This is where the California Revolution starts. We're trying to figure out what's gone wrong with California and how we can put it right. And today it's going to be just me. Kristen's not here, no guest, just me, but plenty to talk about. And I want to start with something that it just captures, I think, so much of what's gone wrong in the past year or so as we've been handling and dealing with this pandemic here in California. Actually, it was a small story in a local paper near where I live in the Bay Area, in the Palo Alto Daily News or whatever it's called. I can't remember the name. And it's just absolutely staggering. I'm just going to read you what it says here in this little story, and then we can get into what's so outrageous about it. Headline, reopening process will last for months. Talking about the city of Menlo Park in the Bay Area. Listen to this. This is from Monday, so yesterday. We're now speaking on a Tuesday, so this is a day ago that this number will have gone up. I'm going to read you this paragraph. 78% of residents aged 12 and older are vaccinated in San Mateo County, which includes Menlo Park. 78%. That's an incredibly high number. Bound to have gone up already. By the time you listen to this, whenever that may be, it's probably over 80%, heading towards 90%, maybe even higher than that. And this isn't just adults. This is residents aged 12 and older. This has got to be one of the highest figures for vaccination in the entire country. Absolutely in that territory that we used to hear about when people talk about herd immunity, and people say, well, what is herd immunity? We'll be safe when we get to herd immunity, either through vaccination or people having had coronavirus themselves. And there was a debate over what that level is. Is it 70%, 75%, 80%, or whatever? This is absolutely in that territory and is heading higher. And remember, this isn't just adults. This is everyone aged 12 and over. So that's great news, you would think, and grounds for completely ending all coronavirus restrictions. But oh no, Menlo Park City Council published its reopening plan. It's got 4 phases lasting until December this year, the end of the year. And then what I just couldn't believe is this one. I'm going to read the whole thing because it's so ridiculous. But just listen to this one. Phase 3, later in September, October, and November, will include indoor gyms, general public access to City Hall, and indoor gymnastics. In other words, they are keeping gyms closed until at least September, and they're already roughly 80% vaccinated. It is complete madness. Like, what is this even based on? This is a decision made by Menlo Park City Council. So you think, well, who are they? I had a look at Menlo Park City Council, and I searched all over the website, the council members, the officers. There's not a single person there. There's not a department or a person or an officer or anyone who has anything related to health or public health or anything like that in their title or job description. Here's Menlo Park City Council, City Attorney's Office, City Manager's Office, Administrative Services, Finance, Human Resources, IT, Community Development, Building Division, Housing, Economic Development, Planning Division. I mean, it's just the library, Public Works. Most of what they do relates to zoning and permitting, etc. There's nothing here about health. Who's making this decision? What is it even based on? They are insane. And what do we do about it? And this is the whole problem. And it actually made me question one of the things I believe in most deeply, which is this whole idea of localism. That you should be making decisions as close to people as possible. We shouldn't be centralizing things. This country is far too centralized. The Biden regime is trying to centralize power, taking control from states and local governments over everything from, childcare and housing and all the rest of it. We should be decentralizing power. Well, this is decentralized power in action. This is the Menlo Park City Council deciding that gyms will stay closed. Gyms, a place of health. Gyms will be closed until at least September, when already you're nearly at 80% vaccination for people aged over 12. It's a local decision, which in a way I would support. the concept that it should be made at that level. But the problem is that there's just no accountability. So I saw this story in the local paper. I don't know how many people read this local paper, barely any these days. Everyone's on their phones. This is a sort of physical newspaper. It's lying around in various places around town. So these people just make these decisions without any accountability. Do you know who your local councillor is? Did you vote for them? Have you had the first idea who they are, what they stand for, whatever? It's a really big problem. And somehow we have to figure out this whole question of accountability when you have such power over your daily life. I would say rightly in the hands of local officials, but when they do crazy things like this, what are you supposed to do about it? And you'll say, well, vote them out at the next election. When is that? What can we do? The whole thing is so infuriating. And I don't have a good answer, but I think it's worth talking about, because that whole concept of where power lies and who's accountable, I think is really at the heart of so much that's going wrong in California, because there's just not enough scrutiny of our public officials making these huge decisions. Sometimes not huge, but decisions that affect us so deeply. And there's just no scrutiny, no accountability. Local newspapers are dying out. There's no media coverage. I mean, we're here to try and bring some accountability, but we can't cover, every single example. This is just Menlo Park here in the Bay Area where I live. I mean, imagine what's going on all across the state where you live. Probably crazy people like the Menlo Park City Council doing exactly this kind of thing. All right. Going from that to another example of a real problem of lack of scrutiny and accountability causing huge things to go wrong in the state. Another example of that, I think, is just you get these big decisions made at the state level and there's just not enough coverage. If you think about the way that the media covers national politics, you may not like what goes on in Congress and with the president and so on, but there's a lot of attention on it. People talk about it. And in fact, that's one thing I think seems to have happened over the last few years, is sort of a nationalization of the coverage and conversation around politics and government. It's all, especially under Trump, you saw that with Trump. So it's all about what Trump does and Congress, and that's what tends to be covered and people talk about. But actually so much gets done at the state level. Again, something I really support, but there's not enough coverage of it, not enough scrutiny of it. And so terrible things happen. Here's an example. The Newsom regime in California has been this is something we've talked about before. They've been handing out these no bid contracts for big service, big parts of service provision. They're just handing out contracts to contractors, private sector companies, without any competitive bidding. Here's one. This company, OptumServe, was awarded a $221 million contract for vaccinations, for providing vaccinations. They promised 100,000 a day. This is back in January when they got this contract. They've now delivered 370,000 since January. They've delivered 370,000 since January after promising 100,000 a day. Now, these numbers aren't even up to date. This was just this actually doesn't even include May. I did a very rough back of the envelope calculation, not even including the month of May. Instead of 100,000 a day, the number's closer to like 3,000 a day. It's an unbelievably tiny fraction of what they promised. They've actually delivered 1.1% of the total vaccinations in California, 34 million in the state. They've done 1.1% after promising 100,000 a day. In some, they've been doing this all across the state in various counties. In some places, they haven't even hit their own minimum target of 420 vaccinations per day. You've got a whole bunch of counties complaining that these people are hopeless or whatever. Massive contract awarded, no bid. So then let's look at this company, OptumServe. Turns out that it's got it's also got a subsidiary, Logistics Health, and all of it. This company together, they've had 3 no bid contracts over the past year or so, $1 billion total, and it's all owned by one big company, United Health. And guess what has been uncovered. United Health been awarded these no-bid contracts, totally failing, donated $131,000 to Gavin Newsom's recall effort. It is so outrageous. It is totally corrupt. No-bid contracts given to a massive donor. They totally fail. What are the consequences? Where's the accountability? The whole thing is just outrageous. I mean, there's no other word for it. It's just totally clear corruption. We've talked about it before. These donors giving money, and then giving money, going around the rules with these things called behested payments. We don't even know if there are examples of behested payments given to Gavin Newsom or asked for by Gavin Newsom from this company. This is just a straightforward political donation, 131,000. That's all there. We're going to look into it more, but they're giving money to the governor. He's giving out these no bid contracts. They're totally failing to deliver what they promised. Where are the consequences? Where's the accountability? And this is just one small thing. This is just vaccinations. Just think about all of that multiplied across the state. When you think about what's going wrong, the way that things just don't work properly, the way the state is just not governed properly, and think, why does it all go wrong? Well, partly because there's just no accountability. There's no competition. These contracts are awarded to whoever gives money to the politicians. It's really kind of banana republic type corruption. But because there's no real scrutiny, you've got a few, really good government kind of websites or journalistic enterprises. Cal Matters, I think, is really good, exposes all this non-profit. But, they don't have the reach. They don't have the kind of, they don't generate the kind of awareness that we need if we're going to hold these politicians properly accountable. It's a really big problem. You saw it with that local story, Menlo Park City Council, who's keeping track of what they do, this contract, and there's probably thousands of others where there's just a real problem and we don't even know about it, let alone try and put pressure on the politicians to do something about it. Right, let's look at another thing that it's just unbelievable when you think about how they get away with this stuff. I don't know. I guess that's the reason we're doing this show, to shine a spotlight on some of this. This is Gavin Newsom and his budget that was recently published, the update to the budget. Turns out that this is a report from the Legislative Analyst's Office. So this is an independent part of the state government. So the other week he publishes this budget, and do you remember all through last year, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, there was it's going to be a crisis. We're going to run out of money because of the pandemic. We're going to have to cut services and so on. Actually, because of the way that the tax system works, a lot of it based on, I think the number is, the top 1% of earners pay about 50% of all the tax revenue in California. A lot of that comes from capital gains. The stock market's done really well. So actually huge amounts of money coming in. Add on top of that all the money coming in from the federal government with all these bailouts, and you had this massive surplus. And Gavin Newsom was touting the surplus, $76 billion, he said, was the surplus. So then, of course, because this is, he's trying to get reelected, or he's trying to fight off the recall, and he wants everyone to like him. He's sort of handing out the money and an endless list of new promises and programs. I think there's sort of 400 different new programs that he was giving out the money for. We've talked about some of that before. 12 billion for homelessness, even though they're already spending 13 billion, and that's actually not even making the problem better. In fact, as our guest Michael Schellenberger the other day says, is making the problem worse. So he's just announcing all this spending. First point, turns out that the actual estimate wasn't the actual surplus was not the 76 billion that he announced and then immediately spent. Turns out to be 38 billion, because some of the stuff he was including in his total was stuff that he's got to spend money on anyway, and the Legislative Analyst's Office does not consider to be available money to spend on new things. So that's the first thing that was pointed out the other day. And then on a new update, they're saying that he's not even the things that he's proposing to spend money on that he can't even afford, and he's making these promises. So this is another update on the revenue forecast, and said that actually, because so much of what he's promised depends on uptake from people, so they call it caseload-driven programs, such as health and human services and so on, and they say that the costs always tend to be higher than what the politician promises. That's just a historic thing. And they absolutely think they'll be substantially higher. That's their word, substantially higher than the administration's estimate across a range of budget areas. In other words, everything about this is wrong. He's announced this surplus. It's, I don't know, like tens of billions of dollars more than what he actually has to spend. And then even within his new spending plans, he totally underestimated the costs. So we're just going to make it worse. Whereas what you actually should be doing, which many people have pointed out, particular fantastic group that I'm sure you'll get to know a lot if you listen to California Rebel Base, because they just do fantastic work on the detail of some of these issues. A group called Govern for California that really get into the detail of some of this policymaking, particularly the massive cost to the state of the pension obligations that have been handed out by Democrat politicians in order to win political support from public sector unions, particularly the teachers' unions, and actually, we talk about that a lot, but actually even more so by the prison officers' unions and so on. So they make all these promises. A lot of the money that's spent doesn't actually reach schools and the things that they promise. It goes straight to fund luxury pensions and healthcare for the government unions, who then give the money and so on. So Government for California points all that out. You've now got the Legislative Analyst's Office pointing this out, and the conclusion they come to is, in fact, you got this surplus that's ended up being, it's bigger than. It's much smaller than what Gavin Newsom said. On the other hand, it's still billions of dollars. What you should really be doing with that money is putting it in reserves for future years where you may not have this surplus, because the whole way the tax revenues of California are structured means it's very unpredictable and very unreliable. A huge part of it depends on the stock market, because so much of it is based on capital gains from the very small number of very rich people in California. And so you can't predict easily what the revenues are going to be from year to year. So there's a real, if you're trying to run things properly, you'd put money aside and put a lot more money into reserves. And now you're having all these groups saying that. But of course, Gavin Newsom, not interested in any of that. He just wants to spend, win vote. You can say buy votes. And again, it just comes back to that question of, like, where's the accountability for any of this? People can complain about the fact that the services are so poor, particularly in education. The schools are so poor. I mean, just the detail of how the public schools are failing in California, that's a whole other thing to get into. And you can legitimately ask, well, hang on a second, we spend all this money. Newsom wants to spend even more. Where's it going? And this is the kind of scrutiny we have to give. It's so important. Otherwise, it's just going to continue to get worse. We've seen one example. It's going to these corrupt contracts to these service providers that totally failed. We just talked about that with the vaccinations. It's going to the teacher unions. That's why the spending that they tout on schools or whatever doesn't actually result in better education standards. It's structurally dishonest, the way that a lot of this is presented. And as I say, not enough scrutiny. That's what we're hoping to change. So one last thing I want to talk about is actually the thing that's in front of us in terms of the accountability for some of these failures of Gavin Newsom, which is, of course, the recall election, which is coming up. But we don't know when. We know it's qualified, talk about it a lot on the show, but we don't yet have the timing. When will the election be? When will the recall election actually happen? And the conventional wisdom, all the talk that I've heard about this up till now has been that the Democrats, who control the state legislature, of course, and through that can affect some of the aspects, not all of the aspects of the timing, but some of the aspects. Their incentive is to delay the recall election as far as possible on the grounds that the more that we recover from the pandemic, the more that things open up, restrictions are lifted. We got the June the 15th removal of the mask mandates and other restrictions and so on. I think that the more that life gets back to normal, the better it will be for Gavin Newsom, and therefore there's an incentive to push the recall as far down the line as possible. So I've heard people say they're even trying to push it into next year. That seems crazy to me. The consensus that I've heard is November. It's going to be in November. That's when elections usually are. There's a few other elections happening, so they're going to put the recall for November. And the first thing I've heard that contradicts that, very interestingly, was from a guy called Steve Glazer. He's actually he's Democrat in the Bay Area here. He's I think he's running himself a statewide office. I'm not sure. He's certainly a prominent Democrat, and he said that this is wrong, that they should get on with it as quickly as possible because there's a whole bunch of uncertainties out there that could jeopardize Gavin Newsom's re-election. So let's get on with it as quickly as possible. The main one he points to is the potential for power outages as a result of wildfires and so on. And he's saying, look, and that's a real point. We're already seeing that it's a bad year in terms of the drought. And if it turns out to be the case that during the summer, we've got more of the power outages that we saw them last year, of course. And if there's more of them, the power turned off to protect the electricity supply. Now you've got a drought across the west of America, not just California, but the whole of the west, which means that power outages are going to be more common. That could be a real problem. And I think he's right. And it's kind of an interesting thought on the timing. I'd assumed it was going to be in November, but maybe they, I don't know to what extent they can actually bring it forward. How early they can have it. But anyway, it's an interesting point. But the other real point beneath all that is that actually the power outages and all the problems that come with wildfires, that's just another reason to recall him, because we've got this absolutely terrible legacy of completely ignoring Democrats, like this governor and the previous one, completely ignoring all the evidence that points to the need to run our forests properly, to actually mitigate against wildfires. Don't just blame it on climate change. Do the work that's necessary to actually avoid this happening. Just like we know we know that this is how to do it, because for centuries this was done by native Californians. Controlled burns, thinning the forest, making sure it doesn't get too dense. All this stuff is well known and completely ignored for years by the Democrats. So actually, it's a fair point, they should be punished for this. There should be some accountability for that. I think that they are, finally learning that lesson. But the other thing that it reminds me of is that, and this is a sort of a longer, deeper question, but as with so many other things, I think the whole way that we organize electricity has just become much too centralized. We're totally dependent on this grid system with kind of a centralized grid and sort of sending power between states, and it's all big and massive engineering, and you've got the pylons and the wires and all that transmission of electricity from in the huge distances. Actually, in some other countries, this is something I looked at a lot when I was working back in the day in the UK government. There are countries with really great examples of a decentralized energy system where actually you're generating electricity much closer to the places where it's going to be needed. So you have a decentralized grid, which is far more reliable because it's not so fragile. It's not vulnerable to these big shocks. So I think that is a really interesting change that we should be looking at and moving towards. But again, it's not consistent with the way that things have been run, and you've got these massive power companies, and they're kind of in bed with the state regulators and the state politicians, and you see the consequences of that with these power outages and this appalling way of running a whole system. So I don't know. I think that is a longer term conversation. The short term conversation is whether or not what is the incentive for Gavin Newsom's is to have an earlier recall or a later one. And what, if anything, can he do about it? I'm not really sure, but it's interesting that Steve Glazer has been the first voice saying it's in Gavin Newsom's interest to get this recall over with as quickly as possible. Makes you think, well, what does he know that we don't about what's down the line? We will see. We'll cover it, of course, and I hope you'll be here with us. Do please come back again next time for the next California Rebel Base.